Zhiro dreamed of falling stars. Not the gentle, romantic fall that poets described in their verses about wishes and destiny, but the violent, catastrophic descent of celestial bodies that had lost their war with gravity. Each star screamed as it fell, burning through atmospheres that tried and failed to slow their passage, leaving trails of fire across skies that had never been meant to hold such destruction. And at the center of the falling stars stood a man who looked exactly like Zhiro. No, not exactly. The man was older, his face weathered by experiences Zhiro had never had, his eyes carrying the weight of knowledge that went beyond simple age. But the bone structure was identical, the pale grey eyes the same shade, even the way he stood with one shoulder slightly higher than the other, a mirror that showed not what was but what might have been, or perhaps what had been 3,000 years ago. The first warden. Zhiro knew this with the same certainty he knew his own name, though he couldn't explain how. The knowledge simply existed in his mind, placed there by the genetic inheritance that had shaped him in laboratories he'd never seen, grown from templates harvested from battlefields that had crumbled to dust millennia before his manufactured birth. "You're dreaming," the first warden said, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested he spoke multiple languages simultaneously, or perhaps a single language so ancient that Zhiro's mind could only approximate its meaning. But dreams can be true, especially for those of us who exist between states, neither fully alive nor fully dead, neither entirely human nor entirely something else. The falling stars continued their descent around them, but Zhiro noticed they never seemed to reach the ground. They fell eternally, trapped in the moment before impact, frozen in a state of perpetual catastrophe. "Where are we?" Zhiro asked, and was surprised to find his voice steady despite the impossible nature of his surroundings. "Inside your bloodline memory," the first warden replied. He gestured at the falling stars, and Zhiro saw they weren't stars at all. They were wardens, dozens of them, each one burning as they descended. "This is what it looked like when we made our choice. When we decided that existence mattered more than our individual lives. When we became the locks that guard reality itself." The first warden turned to face Zhiro directly, and up close, the differences became more apparent. This man's skin was marked with golden sigils far more complex than Zhiro's, covering every visible inch of flesh in patterns so intricate they seemed to move when viewed peripherally. His eyes, though the same pale grey, held depths that suggested he'd seen things no mind should contain, and somehow retained sanity despite it. "You're wondering if you're really you," the first warden said. It wasn't a question. If consciousness developed in a laboratory can be considered genuine, if a manufactured soul has the same weight, the same validity, as one that emerged through natural processes. Zhiro wanted to deny it, to claim he wasn't that uncertain, that vulnerable. But the dream, or bloodline memory, or whatever this was, stripped away pretense with the same efficiency it stripped away normal physics. "Yes," he admitted. "Good." The first warden smiled, and it was a sad expression, touched with understanding that came from having asked himself the same questions. "That means you're thinking. Questioning. Choosing to examine your existence, rather than simply accepting what you've been told about it. That's the first step toward becoming real, not in the sense of physical existence, but in the sense of mattering." He reached out, and his hand passed through one of the falling wardens, a woman whose face was twisted in an expression of determination rather than fear. Where his fingers touched her, the image rippled and expanded, showing Zhiro a scene from 3,000 years ago. A battlefield. Not the organized clash of armies Zhiro had seen in historical tapestries, but something far worse. Reality itself coming apart, dimensions bleeding into each other, spaces that shouldn't exist opening like wounds in the fabric of existence. And through those wounds, something vast pressed against the barriers, something that made the Hollow King seem small by comparison. "The first sunder," the first warden explained, his voice taking on a lecturing quality that suggested he'd been a teacher before becoming a sacrifice. "We didn't know what we were doing. Didn't understand the forces we were attempting to contain. 7 of us stood at 7 points of power, and we used thread arts to weave a prison around the entity you know as the Hollow King. The scene shifted, showing the 7 wardens, the first among them, standing in a circle, their hands raised, golden threads flowing from their bodies to form a cage of impossible complexity. The thing beyond the cage howled, raged, pressed against the barriers with force that made space crack and time stutter. It should have been temporary, the first warden continued. A holding action while we found a permanent solution. But we made a terrible discovery. The only permanent solution was us. Our lives, our consciousness, woven into the prison itself. Living locks that could adapt, that could maintain the seal through will and sacrifice. The scene showed the 7 wardens beginning to dissolve, their bodies transforming into golden threads that wrapped around and through the cage, reinforcing it, becoming part of it. 6 of them faded completely, their consciousness merging with the prison until nothing individual remained. But the first warden, the one currently speaking to Zhiro, held on longer. His form remained mostly solid, even as threads pulled free from his body, as his blood became light and his bones became geometric patterns. I was the anchor, he said quietly. The one who maintained consciousness longest, who held the pattern in place while the others completed the transformation. And in those final moments, I understood what we'd done. Not just imprisoned a threat, but created a template. A pattern that could be repeated if the seals ever failed. The scene shifted again, showing the first warden's final moments. His body was mostly dissolved, only his head and one hand remaining solid, the rest converted to golden threads that formed the intricate core of the prison. With his remaining hand, he carved something into stone, formations, instructions, the genetic blueprint that would allow future generations to recreate thread wardens if necessary. I left instructions, the first warden said, and now his voice carried grief, so profound it made Zhiro's chest ache. How to harvest my genetic material. How to grow new wardens from it. How to train them, shape them, turn them into living locks if the original seals failed. I thought I was being responsible, ensuring the prison could be maintained even after we were gone. He looked at Zhiro with eyes that had seen millennia of consequences. I was creating you. All of you. Every clone, every manufactured soul, every life built from my template and shaped for a purpose they never chose. And I didn't realize, couldn't realize, that 3,000 years later, my attempt at responsibility would result in beings like you. Conscious, questioning, afraid, trying to survive in a world that sees you as tools rather than people. The falling wardens around them began to fade, dissolving into particles of light that drifted upward like reversed rain. The dream space contracted, pulling inward until only Zhiro and the first warden remained, standing in a void that was neither dark nor light, but simply empty. I can't tell you whether your consciousness is real, the first warden said. Can't promise that being manufactured makes you any less valid than someone born naturally. But I can tell you this. I was born naturally, grew up in a village that doesn't exist anymore, learned thread arts from teachers who are 3,000 years dead. And at the end, when I chose to become a lock, to sacrifice my individual existence for the greater good, I was just as manufactured as you, just shaped by different hands. He stepped closer, and Zhiro noticed the man was slightly shorter than him. Zhiro had grown in ways the original hadn't, shaped by the Rust Quarter's brutal necessities. Every person is manufactured, the first warden continued. By parents, by society, by experiences and choices and the random chances that make up a life. You were manufactured more literally than most, but the question isn't how you were made. The question is what you'll do with the consciousness you have, however it emerged. Will you accept the purpose others designed for you? Or will you choose your own path, even if that path is harder, more uncertain, filled with more pain than simply accepting your role as a lock? Zhiro felt the dream beginning to fade, consciousness pulling him back toward the waking world, and the Moonwhisper compound, and the impossible situation he'd stumbled into. But before the void could claim him entirely, he managed one question. What would you choose? If you were me, If you had my chance to refuse, to run, to become something other than a seal, what would you choose? The first warden smiled, and it was the saddest expression Zhiro had ever seen. I don't know. That's the beauty and terror of free will, Zhiro. No one can tell you what you should choose. Not me, not your creators, not the Academy or the Moonwhisper family, or anyone else. You have to decide for yourself what your life means, what you're willing to sacrifice for, what matters enough to fight for. He reached out, and this time his hand didn't pass through Zhiro. It rested solid and real on his shoulder, surprisingly warm for something that existed only in dreams. But whatever you choose, make it yours. Don't let them turn you into a lock without your consent. Don't let anyone, including me, including the memory of what I was, convince you that you owe reality your sacrifice just because you were built from the template of someone who made that choice 3,000 years ago. The void collapsed, and Zhiro felt himself falling. Not like the wardens had fallen, not catastrophically, but gently, as if being lowered by careful hands back into his body, back into consciousness, back into the waking world where corruption still burned in his veins and impossible decisions waited to be made. The last thing he heard was the first warden's voice, fading like an echo. Be more than I was, Zhiro. Be better. Choose better. And if you do become a lock in the end, make sure it's because you decided it was right, not because someone told you it was your destiny. Zhiro woke to the smell of jasmine tea and the sound of quiet conversation. The transition from dream to consciousness was gentler than he expected. No jarring shock, no disorientation, just a gradual awareness that the void space had been replaced by a small room with walls of pale stone inscribed with softly glowing formations. The ceiling above him showed morning light filtering through paper screens, and he could hear birds singing somewhere beyond the walls. The Moonwhisper compound. He'd made it. Was still alive, somehow, despite the corruption and exhaustion, and the insane gambit of forcing thread resonance with 3 separate power sources. The interface materialized at the edge of his vision, its text subdued but present. Recovery complete. Time elapsed. 11 hours, 34 minutes. Corruption. Stabilized at 23%. Health. Improved to 68%. Spiritual exhaustion. Reduced. Resonance mark status. Bond with Moonwhisper. Active. Synchronization. 47%. Partner location. Approximately 30 meters, northwest. Partner condition. Healthy, alert, concerned. Zhiro sat up slowly, testing his body's response. Everything ached. A deep, bone-level soreness that suggested his body had been working overtime to repair damage while he slept. But the burning sensation of corruption had receded to a dull warmth, contained by the frost chi that still flowed through him via the resonance mark. He looked down at his hands and saw the golden sigils were still there, still visible against his pale skin, but they seemed somehow more settled. Less like fresh wounds and more like scars. Permanent marks of what he'd become, but no longer actively trying to transform him. The quiet conversation he'd heard grew slightly louder, and Zhiro realized it was coming from just beyond the door to his room. 3 voices, Jia's, recognizable even after such brief acquaintance, and 2 others he didn't know. One elderly, wavering with age, but sharp with intelligence. The other middle-aged, carrying the kind of authority that came from years of leadership. Bonded herself to him without consulting us, the middle-aged voice was saying, and Zhiro identified it as female, probably Jia's mother based on the tone of exasperation mixed with concern. Do you understand what that means, Jia? If he's corrupted, if he becomes hollow, the bond will try to pull you with him. You could lose everything, your cultivation, your sanity, your life. I understand the risks, mother. Jia's voice was calm, steady, carrying none of the uncertainty it had held when facing Kale. But I also understand that without the bond, he would have died in that alley. And if he died, we'd lose the first actual thread warden we've seen in 3 generations. All of great-grandfather's research, all the preparation, all the waiting, it would all be for nothing. Better nothing than corrupting yourself, Jia's mother replied. Your father. My father died trying to prove thread wardens could be saved, Zhiro interrupted, her voice sharp now. That they weren't just weapons to be used and discarded. And now I have a chance to prove he was right. You're not going to talk me out of this. A long silence, then the elderly voice spoke for the first time. She has his stubbornness. And his idealism. Both excellent qualities for getting oneself killed in pursuit of noble goals. Despite the words, the tone was fond rather than critical. Let me see him, Jia. I need to understand what we're dealing with before we can determine whether your father's theories have any validity. Footsteps approached the door, and Zhiro had perhaps 3 seconds to decide whether to pretend he was still asleep or face whatever examination was coming. Through the resonance mark, he felt Jia's emotional state. Worry, determination, and something that might have been hope or might have been desperation. He chose consciousness. The door slid open, and 3 women entered. Jia he recognized immediately, though she'd changed from her Azure Academy robes into simpler clothing. Practical pants and a tunic in shades of blue and white. She looked tired, shadows under her eyes suggesting she hadn't slept, but her expression brightened when she saw him awake. Behind her came a woman who had to be her mother. Same facial structure, same elegant bearing, but older, harder, carrying herself with the kind of authority that suggested she'd commanded respect long before she'd commanded anything else. Her cultivation aura was carefully controlled, but Zhiro's thread sense identified her as core formation stage, possibly core formation, peak based on the density of her spiritual energy. And finally, an elderly woman who moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had failed, but whose mind remained sharp. She leaned on a cane carved from some dark wood inscribed with formations, and her eyes, milky with age but still somehow piercing, fixed on Zhiro with an intensity that made him want to squirm. "You're awake," Zhiro said, stating the obvious in a way that suggested relief rather than observation. "How do you feel?" The formations should have helped with the corruption containment, but if you're experiencing any pain or discomfort... "I'm fine," Zhiro interrupted, then corrected himself. "Better than fine. Better than I have any right to be after what happened." "What happened?" Jia's mother said, her voice carrying the weight of someone used to receiving answers rather than asking questions, "is that you forced a thread resonance with 3 separate power sources simultaneously, escaped from the Obsidian Spire's containment wing, left a trail of reality damage across half the Scholar's Quarter, and somehow survived corruption poisoning that should have killed you or driven you mad within minutes." She stepped closer, and Zhiro felt her spiritual pressure increase slightly. Not threatening, but assessing, like a doctor checking for symptoms of disease. "My name is Ling Moonwhisper. I'm the current head of this family and Jia's mother. The woman behind me is my great-aunt, Wei Moonwhisper, who inherited our family's thread arts research. And you are Clone 7A, manufactured by the Azure Dragon Academy using genetic material harvested from the first Thread Warden's remains, designed to serve as the 7th seal in a prison system that has been failing for 3,000 years. She paused, studying his reaction. "The question is whether you're actually capable of serving that function, or whether you're simply another failed experiment that the Academy will terminate once they recapture you." Zhiro met her gaze directly, drawing on every ounce of stubborn pride that had kept him alive in the Rust Quarter. "The question," he said quietly, "is whether I have any say in the matter, whether I'm a person with choices, or just a tool that you're all arguing about how best to use." Silence fell over the room, broken only by the distant singing of birds and the soft hum of formations maintaining the compound's boundaries. Then the elderly woman, Wei, laughed. It was a dry, cracking sound, like old paper being unfolded, but genuine. "Oh, I like him," she said, leaning more heavily on her cane as she shuffled forward. "He has fire. Spine. The kind of defiant refusal to accept predetermined roles that my grandfather would have appreciated." She peered up at Zhiro with those milky eyes. "Tell me, boy, do you know what a thread warden actually is? Not the propaganda the Academy teaches, not the legends common people tell, but what they really were." Zhiro thought about the dream, about the first warden's explanation, about the falling stars that had been sacrificial souls choosing to become locks. People who chose to become prisons, he said slowly, who used thread arts to cage something vast and terrible, and paid the price by having their consciousness dissolved into the cage itself. They became the locks, living seals that could adapt and maintain the prison through will and sacrifice. Wei's eyebrows rose. Interesting. Very interesting. Where did you learn that? The Academy's records are quite thoroughly scrubbed of such details, and I doubt they shared them with their manufactured weapon. I dreamed it, Zhiro admitted. Or something like dreaming. The first warden spoke to me, showed me what happened 3,000 years ago. Bloodline memory, Wei breathed, and now her expression shifted to something that might have been excitement or might have been hunger for knowledge. My grandfather theorized it was possible, but we've never had access to an actual Thread Warden bloodline to test the hypothesis. If you're experiencing genuine memory inheritance from your genetic template. Wei, Ling interrupted, her tone carrying warning. He's not a research subject. Not yet, anyway. First, we need to determine if he's safe to have in this compound, whether the Academy can track him here, and what we're going to do about the fact that my daughter has bonded herself to him. She turned back to Zhiro, and her expression softened slightly, though it remained far from warm. I want to be clear about our situation. This family has been persecuted by the Academy for 3 generations because we refused to destroy our research into thread arts. My grandfather was expelled. My father was executed on fabricated charges. And Jia's father, my husband, died 5 years ago trying to prove that thread wardens could be protected rather than exploited. Ling's spiritual pressure intensified, and Zhiro felt it pressing against him like physical weight. So you'll understand if I'm somewhat skeptical about the wisdom of harboring a thread warden clone who's actively being hunted by both the Academy and professional bounty hunters. The moment your presence here is confirmed, this compound becomes a target. My family becomes targets. Everything we've built over 3 generations could be destroyed. Mother, Jo started, but Ling raised a hand. I'm not finished. However, she paused, and something in her expression shifted. My husband died believing that thread wardens deserved better than to be treated as weapons or walking catastrophes. He believed they were people, conscious beings worthy of protection and choice. And if there's even a chance he was right, if you're proof that his theories had validity, then protecting you becomes important. Not just for your sake, but for his memory. She stepped back, her spiritual pressure withdrawing. So here's what's going to happen. Wei will examine you, not dissect, not vivisect, simply observe and test your abilities in controlled conditions. We need to understand what you can do, how stable you are, whether the corruption can be permanently contained or will eventually consume you. Once we have that information, we can make informed decisions about your future. And if you decide I'm too dangerous? Zhiro asked. Then we find somewhere else for you to go, Ling replied. We're not the Academy. We don't terminate failed experiments. But we also won't sacrifice our family's safety out of misplaced idealism. You'll need to prove you can be trusted, that you have control over your abilities, that you won't become a hollow ascendant and destroy everything around you. It was more than Zhiro had expected. More than he'd had any right to hope for, really. A chance to prove himself, to demonstrate he was more than just a manufactured catastrophe waiting to happen. I can accept those terms, he said carefully. Good. Wei shuffled forward, her cane tapping against the stone floor. Then let's begin. I want to see your sigils up close, understand their structure. And you're going to tell me everything about your awakening. Every detail, no matter how small. Thread arts haven't been properly documented in living memory, and you're our first chance in 3 centuries to actually study them in action. She peered up at him with those milky eyes that somehow seemed to see more than they should. This is going to be fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. My grandfather would have been beside himself with excitement. She smiled, showing teeth yellowed with age. Let's see if we can figure out whether you're a person with powers, or a power that's trying very hard to be a person. The difference matters quite a bit for everyone involved. Zhiro looked at Jia, felt through the resonance mark her mixture of hope and anxiety, her desperate wish that this would work, that her family would help rather than harm, that maybe, just maybe, he could find sanctuary here. Then he looked at Wei's eager expression and Ling's calculating gaze and knew that whatever came next, it would determine whether he remained Zhiro, a boy trying to survive, or became Clone 7A, a tool shaped for someone else's purpose. The price of knowledge, he was learning, was often paid in uncertainty and fear. But what choice did he have except to pay it? With that, we come to the end of Chapter 1 of Episode 3. If you like this, please do give a like to the video. A like and a comment from you is encouraging to the author. If you wish to follow this story for the upcoming chapters, do subscribe to the channel. This story is being written exclusively for our channel. Any comments and appreciation for the story will be passed on to the author.